Welcome, everybody, to our webinar on heat stress. It's August. We're nearing the end of the really hot weather, but this is where it really starts to drag on. And we've got some pretty oppressive weather where we are here in Virginia and a lot of humidity. And when we couple those really high temperatures with humidity, it makes it very difficult for horses to regulate their own temperature. So we've got to look at other things we can do. Earlier in the summer, I was fortunate to go on a camping trip with my family down into Texas and across and up into Utah, and everybody said, well, that's a dry heat. And while a dry heat does make it easier to dissipate heat because you can sweat and the sweat will evaporate and that really helps to cool, it's still very, very hot. It was very, very hot. But when you have that humidity, it really just adds another level. I was craving humidity though. So some signs of heat stress. We might think, well, it's not so hot, but let's say you have a new horse to your barn that isn't used to that heat, or you've just started a new horse and they haven't been doing much exercise, and now they have been. And just like people, everybody deals with heat a little differently. I know those first few workouts that I do at the gym when the warm weather starts, I feel like I'm going to die because I'm just not used to it. And then over the summer I get more used to it. But every body and every horse is different. So what I always say is you have to know what is normal for your horse. So when it's not hot or not cold and when they're not exercising, I want you to know and have it written down. And really, it should be on a stall card on the front of every single stall in your barn is what is normal for every horse. What is the normal pulse rate? What is their normal respiration rate? How many breaths per minute they do? How much water they normally drink? So that when it's different to that, we can say to the vet, well, this is what they're doing now, and this is what they normally have. So that we know that, what is normal to one horse might be dangerous for another horse, but again, vice versa. An elevated heart rate or really high respiration rate or temperature might be normal for one horse, but be very different for another horse. So it's very, very important. We have guidelines for rectal temperature and breaths per minute and pulse rate, but they're just guidelines and every horse is different. So I would recommend if you run a boarding stable or a training facility that on the front of every stall with the contact details, owner of the horse, veterinarian, whatever else you have on there, that you have the basic breaths per minute, pulse, and temperature that is normal for that horse. And I would even add on that what is a normal amount of water that they would drink per day. Um, so that we know that if the breathing rate is higher and the heart rate is faster than 60 breaths per minute, or what is normal for your horse, that's just a guide. What is normal for your horse? Then we know that can be a sign of heat stress. Reduced feed intake or water intake, elevated rectal temperature, increased heart rate. If they're sweating a lot, but what is even worse is if they've been sweating a lot and now all of a sudden they're not sweating at all. Now we have horses that have anhidrosis, which is when they just don't sweat at all from the get-go. But worst case scenario is we have a horse that has gotten really hot, overheated, was sweating, and now all of a sudden they just can't sweat. Now that's bad. Droopy ears, lethargic, depressed demeanor. Now some horses, you look at them and they look like Goofy already in the stall, but that's just their normal selves. So again, it's very, very important to have a baseline on every horse. Dehydration, so when you do the skin pinch test, you can pinch the skin up on their neck and does it tent or does it snap back into place? You can put your thumb, if you lift up the top lip and put your thumb on the skin above their teeth and you press it, and how fast it takes for the pink color to come back. If it takes more than, I think it's 2 seconds, then we've got some dehydration going on. Tying up and colic-like symptoms would also be signs of heat stress. When horses exercise, let's talk about like thoroughbred race horses. During a race, when they're going all out, and you could think about endurance racing, even barrel racing, their body core temperature can really elevate very quickly. When it's hot and humid outside, as I mentioned, it can become very difficult for those normal cooling mechanisms to work. So, one of the first ways that you or your horse cools itself is by sweating. And when the air evaporates that water or that sweat, it cools them down. And if it's very humid outside, we know that the sweat never dries. You're just constantly wet and you feel like you're breathing water. And so that evaporative cooling mechanism will not work anymore. So um, we need to look at other ways of cooling them, of getting that heat out of the skin. And the skin is the largest surface area of the animal. So they'll breathe really fast so that they can dissipate heat. Heat will come out their ears, but also, so panting in a dog is how they dissipate a lot of heat, and panting in horses they would dissipate heat. But first way for a horse to dissipate heat is through their skin and by sweating. Um, and we have these critical thermal maximum. So if your horse gets over 107 degrees, that is going to be quite lethal to the horse, because at that point we've got organ failure and shutdown, and we call this exertional heat illness, heat stroke in people, and we've got organ failure and organ shutdown, and really that's quite dangerous. Horses that are much higher risk of heat stress are just like people that have not been exercising a lot, are not very fit, and then they go out and do a bunch of exercise, their body isn't conditioned, so they don't tolerate heat very well. Um, Animals that are overweight, older animals, unable to find shade, if they're in poorly ventilated stalls or trailers, heavily muscled horses, because a byproduct of muscles exercising is they produce metabolic heat. So when they physically exercise, the more muscle there is, the more heat production there is. Or if they haven't acclimated to those warmer temperatures. So you'll find, okay, so when we have elite level horses, let's say we have a horse doing 3-day eventing or dressage or jumping at the Olympics, and they live in a really cool climate. Maybe they live in Denmark or Sweden, and it never really gets very hot there. But they're going to go to the Olympics in Brazil or Tokyo, or even when it was here in America. Where was it? Somewhere in the middle of the country, where I'm blanking on where that Olympics was, but it's very hot. Um, and those animals aren't acclimated to those warmer temperatures. What they really should do, and what a lot of people do, is they will move them to a warmer climate, get them acclimated, or even just ride them in the hottest part of the day so they get acclimated to those warmer temperatures, to actually exercising in those warmer temperatures, because it really does change a lot for the animal. As I mentioned, the horses dissipate excess body heat primarily from blood flowing to the skin and dispersing that heat out of that surface area. Sweating eliminates about 70% of the heat generated by exercise, and breathing rapidly about 15% of that heat load. So, sweating is the most productive way for a horse to, that's right, Atlanta. I was like, Alabama, it wasn't Alabama, it was Atlanta. And Atlanta Olympics, it really was the turning point for um, horses competing in hot weather, and research really changing at the Atlanta Olympics. They were feeding those horses very high fat diets, very high in oil, because they just completely wouldn't eat. They had cooling tents. They were doing IV fluids, because they were trying to use a lot more science-based practices to cool these horses down. So when we look at the resting body temperature of the horse, it's typically between 99 and 100 degrees. But again, know what is normal for your horse, because 98 might be normal for your horse, 101 might be normal for your horse. Or if 99 is normal for your horse and your horse is 101, that might be quite a jump. Or if 100 is normal for your horse and they're 101, maybe that's not so bad. But then so average 99 to 100 for a horse doing nothing, just standing out in a field, not super hot. Exercise, it can go up to 101 to 103. If we get above 103 for most, the general guideline is that, they're starting to overheat and we don't want to go any further. Because once we get above 106 degrees Fahrenheit internal body temperature, then we've got like we're going down the route of organ failure and fatality at this point. Heat stroke, causing organ failure, convulsions, heart attack, that kind of thing. But it's not just the heat outside. Like I mentioned, humidity plays a huge role. So when we have this thing called the heat index, and it's the same in people when they're exercising in hot climates as well. And the heat index is really the temperature and the relative humidity combined. So you might have, let's say it's, I don't know, 77 degrees Fahrenheit and 45% humidity. I'll calculate that. 77 plus 45 equals 122. That's very low risk, very normal. Let's say it's 77 degrees out, which by any standards isn't very hot. 77 is quite nice for most people. But let's say it's about to rain, it's really humid out, it's 80% humidity. Now the heat index is 157. So it seemed cool enough, but it's really humid out. So that's really going to decrease their ability to dissipate heat. And now, if we look at our heat index chart, now we're in the high risk category at 157 combined. Um, and that would be very light work only. So you have to take what the temperature is and the humidity, add those together, and then use this chart as a guideline for when we should be exercising our horses. Typically, earlier in the morning or later in the evening, we have the lowest temperatures. I always find earlier in the morning we have the least humidity. Even if the temperatures start to cool at night, we can still have a little higher humidity in those areas where it is humid. So not if you live in Utah. I don't know that they ever have humidity there. Um, but anyway, so this is something else that I would print out and I'd have in my tack stall, especially if I lived in California or anywhere hot. And I would have my handy dandy, like kind of temperature gauge with a humidity gauge on it. And I would be able to add the two together and know whether, maybe I should just be doing light exercise or maybe it's just too dangerous and I should take the day off and I shouldn't like, you know, pretend to be all tough and say, "Oh, we're just going to ride. We're going to work through this," because ultimately your horse is going to tie up and they're just not going to recover very well. I see a lot of horses tie up at the end of spring when the temperatures start to get a little warmer and the horses just haven't had enough conditioning. Maybe they just weren't, they had some time off over the winter and they're just coming back into work. And then we get a nice day and people think, oh, it's a beautiful day. I'm going to go out on a 5 hour trail ride. But your horse is really not that fit. And you come back feeling like, oh my gosh, I can't walk the next day. And your horse is the same. But in the horse, it increases their risk for this kind of transient tying up, which has nothing to do with the diet. It was just that you over exercised them for their fitness level and you cause some muscle damage. So that's just a little side note. But the other thing that when you get your horse really overheated, you can really affect liver and kidney function as well. So let's just say we have a horse that's overheated. Maybe you're at a show and it was really hot, and you were competing, and where they're really panting and they're sweating heavily, or you have young babies out in the field and they weren't able to get any shade. Heaven forbid they ran out of water or something. Bad stuff happens all the time. So you immediately want to get them out of the direct sunlight. We've all been in a situation where if you're in the direct sunlight, it seems so burning hot. But then as soon as the clouds come over, you're like, oh, this isn't so bad. So get them into the shade, provide fresh water and an electrolyte. If you don't have an electrolyte on hand, 2 tablespoons of salt per gallon of water, just plain old um, table salt. out of the kitchen if you don't have any electrolyte available. An adult dehydrated horse may need up to 5 gallons of water. Now, you don't want it to be cold or hot, but here's what I'll say. Do not withhold water ever from a horse. I don't know, I don't care whether the water is hot or cold. If that's all that's available, let them drink the water and let them drink as much as they want. This kind of water colic is not a real thing. Now, if I exercise a lot and I drink a boatload of water, yeah, I might get a bit of a tummy ache. But in horses, they dehydrate way faster than people. So I never withhold water ever. Increase airflow by breeze or fan. Get out a box stall fan, or if you got one of those big shop fans, turn it on. It doesn't matter how loud it is. Let it blow over them. Even if your horse is pretty nervous of loud noises, I'm sure if they're really hot and you turn on that fan, they will all of a sudden not be scared of loud noises. So, and that's that evaporative cooling. You're creating that evaporative cooling, even if it's pretty humid. Place ice packs over where the most flow goes. So in that groove along their neck that runs down the neck, that's where the jugular vein is. We've got a lot of blood pumping around there, so you can put ice packs there. Call your veterinarian if your horse's temperature stays above 103 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, what I always say is your vet, if I say, okay, call your horse once your horse's temperature gets above 103 and it stays there, don't call your vet when you absolutely need them. Call them a little bit before and say, hey, this is the situation. Get them prepared that you might make a follow up call and say, I need you to come. But that way, they know what the story is and they can be prepared to come versus you calling, my horse is colicking and dying right now. I need you here immediately. Because it's not like an ambulance. It could be an hour away, it could be 30 minutes away, it could be 5 minutes away, but we don't know what else is going on in that situation. And to be honest, right now there's a shortage of vets. So give your horse, your vet, a little time. Give them time by giving them some preparation that you might be making. Look, my horse's temperature is 103 or it's rising. I've been riding, they're really hot. I'm worried they're going to have a bit of heat stroke. Just let them know what's happening. Continue to monitor the horse over the next few days, because what we've also found is that if we have a horse that's had a heat stroke or even colic, or colic caused by heat stroke, that in the days that follow, laminitis can still occur and colic can still occur after the fact. So there are things that we can add to the diet and things that we have added to the DAC products that really help with an animal's ability to regulate their stress from heat. So there's an ingredient that we use called chromium, and we use a product from Kemin called Chemtrace Chromium, and it's the only FDA approved chromium. And really what chromium does is it allows the horse to get more glucose into the system, and glucose is fuel for life. And when it comes to any kind of stress, including heat stress, chromium allows the body to get rid of that stress by giving the horse more nutrients to fuel removing that stress, decreasing cortisol, which is a hormone that is secreted by the horse when it is stressed, whether it be heat stress or behavioral stress. Cortisol increases, and chromium can decrease the cortisol concentration in the blood by about 25%. So we know that it is decreasing stress. So in these charts here, we're looking at rectal temperature and respiration rate. So these were two ways that we look at a horse as whether they are going through any kind of stress. Now, these were growing pigs, but it's much, much easier in a controlled environment to stress pigs or chickens or feedlot cattle. So a lot more of the heat stress research is done on those animals. And the yellow lines are animals, the solid line in the rectal temperature and the respiration rate is thermoneutral, so no stress from heat. It's just normal outside temperature. Um, and then the dashed yellow line is when they have chromium, and you can see that there's no difference in those lines when there's no stress going on, whether they got chromium or not. The rectal temperature and the respiration rate is the same. Where it becomes different is the solid line is when we have heat stressed animals with no added extra supplement, and you can see that the rectal temperature is significantly higher and the respiration rate is also significantly higher. But when you add chromium to that animal's diet, the respiration rate and the rectal temperature is significantly lower, and so it's enabling us to decrease the stress on that animal so that they can function more adequately. So the chemtrace chromium, um, it's all to do with glucose and insulin and regulating the clearance of glucose in the bloodstream. And you've heard about glucose and insulin when it comes to a horse with insulin resistance or Cushing's. And we know that horses with those metabolic issues, one of the symptoms is they cannot regulate their heat stress very well. So they will tend to overheat more than a healthy horse. Um, but we know that is one of the ways that they can overcome heat stress is by clearing that glucose, by decreasing that cortisol. And we know that chromium is the way that we can do that. We have it in the racing formula, the vitamin and mineral supplement, the e-boost paste, and the DAC metabolic. Um, this is some interesting information that, again, I would have in my barn, just up on the pin on the notice board. Um, these are signs of dehydration, the physiological, the behavioral signs, the lack of focus, concentration, fatigue, and these are actually the same in people as well. So, on those really hot days, maybe you've got someone out there that's just like busting out doing barn chores, riding, hasn't been drinking enough water, not wearing a hat, and you think, oh, this person is just like gone a little loopy, and then you try to get them to drink or eat and they don't want to, they lose a bit of focus, they're like, why they're a bit forgetful. That's a sign of dehydration in people too. um, and as we mentioned, the elevated body temperature and heart rate and respiration rate. We know that adding fiber to the diet can stimulate thirst. So we want to make sure in the hot weather that we're feeding plenty of hay, because it will encourage them to drink water. Now, you've also probably heard me say that when the bacteria break down fiber, they create heat. So in the summertime, if your horse struggles with thermoregulation, dissipating their heat, you want to make sure that you're feeding a really digestible form of hay, like a second cut, or adding beet pulp or alfalfa, because it's really digestible. You can see typical weight loss after exercise. This is the amount of sweat they will lose in pounds. I think what's fascinating is like ranch work or endurance racing that go for a long time, they can lose up to 40 pounds from one bout of exercise if they're sweating a lot. Eventing, 22 to 66 pounds, harness racing up to 66 pounds. Thoroughbred racing or training isn't quite as much because it's over much shorter times. Um, that capillary refill time, when I said stick your thumb above the teeth and press, 2 seconds or less for the color to return, the horse is fine. But if it's more than 2 seconds, then we worry about dehydration. And then that skin pinch test, when you pinch it up into a tent and see how fast it snaps back, that's also a way to determine whether they're adequately hydrated. Now, we talked a little bit about chromium and how that can help with stress by regulating glucose and insulin. But what else are we adding to the diet? Well, electrolytes. When the animal and you sweat, um, and you're using that evaporative cooling to cool the skin surface, we know that if you have ever tasted sweat, it's really salty. So you lose a lot of electrolyte salts, which is primary sodium chloride, which is salt. Potassium, calcium, and magnesium are the main things that are sweated out when you have that increased sweat level. Muscle cramps, uncoordination, impaired nerve and brain function, these are all like down the track of losing too many electrolytes. Tying up as well, that kind of transient tying up where it's not chronic, so it's not nutrition based, but it's overexercise, and your horse loses, it's really, really hot and they're not used to it, and they lose a lot of electrolytes, then they'll have terrible muscle cramping, and that can also affect liver and kidney function. So sodium and chloride, which is NaCl, that is what salt is. Nothing else in salt. Like, salt is just sodium and chloride. So if it's pink salt or it's got some potassium in it or iodine or whatever, they are all just contaminants in salt. Plain white salt is just sodium and chloride, and that's what makes up the primary electrolytes in any of the electrolyte products, or any that you sweat out. So the saltiness of the blood is measured as it's filtered through the kidneys. And this is the way the body knows how much water to release in the urine to keep the concentration of the salt in the blood at normal levels. So I always say that the body is really good at regulating itself. So this is one way, the electrolyte level in the blood, and it's also why blood is not necessarily the best place to measure um, nutritional status, because the body is always going to make it look like the blood is at normal levels, but it's going to sacrifice other parts of the body. So calcium, for example, is always going to look normal in the blood, but it might be sacrificed by sucking it out of the horse's bones. Same with electrolytes. If you're just measuring the horse's blood, then the sodium and chloride is always going to look normal, but it may actually be really taxing the kidneys, or your horse might be severely dehydrated. Um, Potassium, so potassium, sodium, and chloride are also, you see this positive and negative after them. There's electrical impulses or the electrical stimulation with these electrolytes, and that also stimulates nerve and muscle twitching. So that's why if you are severely deficient in these, we'll have muscle cramping, because we can't actually, the muscle cannot function properly. It can't contract and release. It's why horses with HYPP, hyperkalemic periodic paralysis, the genetic defect in some quarter horses, is the potassium in those muscles constantly twitch, because there's too much potassium in the blood and they're not able to kind of, muscles should be twitch, relax, contract, relax, contract, relax. But in those animals, they're just constantly contracting. It's just like snap, snap. It's like when something's touching the electric fence and it's just constantly snap, 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 snap. It's almost like that. It never just is calm. Calcium, we think about calcium in bones and teeth, but again, it is very important electrolyte. It's a positively charged electrolyte, and it's critical for nerve and muscle function. Magnesium. Say, magnesium gets, it's, someone was asking me about it today and think, oh, I should take magnesium, or I should give my horse plenty of extra magnesium. It's actually pretty rare for magnesium to be deficient in horses, and I think it's the flavor of the month, and everybody wants to add magnesium to their diet. But it is important, but horses usually get plenty of magnesium in their diet, but it is needed in much smaller amounts than other electrolytes, but it does have a critical role. And it's really important. So this is where some of the kind of adding magnesium to a diet to calm the horse is, because we know it is required for muscle function and relaxation, so the decontraction of the muscle. And we know that actually, there's certain types of magnesium that you can add, and if you add very, very large quantities, you can have a very calming effect on the horse. But at those very, very high levels, you also start to interfere with other mineral uptake. So be very careful. So we talked about weight loss earlier, but there can be very significant weight loss depending on the environmental conditions and the amount of time that they're exercising. Here are the ranges of sodium. So really, sodium, potassium, and chloride are the key electrolytes that we can measure and that we measure in sweat when it's lost, and that we try to replace, and that have kind of ranges that we want to stick with. Uh, the most important thing is that electrolyte supplements should not contain a lot of sugar. The reason why they put sugar in things like Gatorade and Powerade is because they want people to continue to drink lots of it, which means you buy lots of it. And that's one way, I guess, to get a person to rehydrate themselves, is just to continually drink and continually drink. But the problem is those elevated sugar can actually block the uptake of some of those electrolyte salts, which is what we're trying to do. Um, you know, Something like Pedialyte for kids is much better for them than Gatorade, for example, but I can't get my kids to drink Pedialyte to save themselves because it actually tastes pretty awful. It's pretty salty compared to Gatorade, which is nice and sweet. So I never like to add it to the water bucket because I want to make sure the horse is actually consuming it, and I just don't know, you know, where if they're really depressed, whether they're actually drinking water. So I want to make sure that they're drinking it, and they're drinking it in a short enough period for it to actually work. The DAC electrolyte has no sugar in it. Um, I recommend supplementing. Some horses exercise year round, and so supplement year round. One of the times, I think most people think about electrolytes in the summertime, but we forget about it in the wintertime, and especially when it's really dry out and the horse is sweating, but it's evaporating very quickly. Is and we don't see the sweat, but they are, still losing a lot of electrolytes. So if you're in a situation like that and you're exercising a lot in the wintertime, then you should still continue to feed an electrolyte in the wintertime as well. Like I mentioned, the primary electrolytes, and a lack of those electrolytes causes fatigue, muscle weakness, and it sounds crazy because you think, oh, a dehydrated horse with that's sweated out a lot of electrolytes. The first thing they're gonna want to do is drink, but actually you can go past that point, and this is where we start to get dangerous when you actually decrease their thirst response. And so now we're in a vicious cycle of they need to drink, but they don't want to, and so we go in a downward spiral from there. People ask about, should I do it before, during, after? And if you look at like endurance riding as the model to work out pre, post, and during exercise, um, I recommend, especially if you know that your horse is going to be competing in hot conditions, that you prime them, and before, trailering to the show, couple of days before, night before, even morning of your competition, that you're giving electrolytes, so that we can prime the system. So we make sure they've got plenty of electrolytes because we know they're going to sweat a lot out. Give them plenty of water, give them plenty of forage. Um, so yeah, in endurance riding, the kind of mantra is early and often. Don't wait until the muscles have cramped. Don't wait until they've lost a lot of electrolytes before you replace them. Kind of give them almost a little bit too much electrolytes so that when they sweat it all out, they're not going to go beyond the point of no return. And they'll provide electrolytes and water at each vet stop. So if you're familiar with long distance endurance racing, they have to go through a certain amount of vet stops. And at each one of those, they check the respiration rate and the kind of vitals on those horses to make sure that it's safe for them to continue. Um, Most programs aggressively supplement after the exercise is gone, but like I said, I really like to prime the system prior to. We mentioned that older horses, even younger horses, less fit, dark colored horses, unclipped, sick, fat horses, they all struggle with the heat more. If you don't train in the heat, your horse won't compete well in the heat. Um, Traveling horses lose around 7 to 10 pounds per hour. Traveling is very tiring. Don't leave your horse standing in a trailer. If you're British, it's called a lorry on hot days. Um, if your horse does one thing at home and they're great, and then you go to a competition and you just wonder why they didn't perform as well. It's hot. There's So we know that stress period decreases performance, and it increases cortisol, which is going to take nutrients away from performance and shunt it towards getting rid of that stress. So at home, everything's happy. It's not hot because we're riding in the early part of the day and they're not stressed by music and other horses and cows or whatever is going on. But then you get to the competition and you've trailered them there. And we know that I think it's like a 3 to 4 hour trailer ride is like cantering for a mile. So just the trailer ride there increases their stress. Then there's music and there's fireworks and there's other horses and it's hot. So we've got all these different, and they don't want to drink because the water tastes terrible. You've got all these different ways that are stressing the horse. And that is what's going to happen is the body is going to shunt nutrients, i.e., glucose, away from performance, away from exercise, and take it to decreasing the cortisol that is caused by that stress. So if we can try and decrease some of that stress, that allows the body not to have to try and send as much nutrients away from what you want them to do to help dissipate that. Water all the time. Never, ever, ever take away water. Um, there is some research in Europe looking at uh, white, some white material, actually putting rugs on white, thin, certain types of material. Rugs on horses will actually reflect the heat, whilst the darker color will absorb the heat. So that's certainly something. I know growing up in Australia, we always had kind of white colored, it was almost like a mesh covers, coolers that we would put on the horse all day. It helped keep the bugs off them, but it also helped keep them cool. Um, this is what the AAEP recently published on their Facebook page, which I think was really, really cool. And we don't think about it. We think about the exercise starts when we get to the show and we start warming up. But really, if your horses, especially if you trailered to the show the morning of, they've already done like a 3 hour long trail ride. It's like you cantered them for a mile. Who canters their horse for a mile? It's pretty common for us to trailer our horses 3 hours to get to where we're going. Think about that like you cantered your horse for a mile. I don't like running a mile, let alone cantering my horse for a mile. So just keep that in mind that the exercise started the minute you put them on the trailer. The DAC electrolyte paste, like we said, has no sugar in it. Um, and the paste and the powder, primarily salt, potassium, magnesium. There's not enough, even in the electrolyte paste and powder, the electrolyte. You could still feed this with a horse with HYPP. You're feeding such small quantities, the horse is going to be fine. I recommend the paste when you're going to a show and you want to make sure that they're getting everything immediately. And the powder is more, we've got a little less stress. They're eating it in their food, more of a daily maintenance. But whether it be electrolyte paste or rescue aid paste or e-boost, use the paste when you absolutely want. It's very imperative that they get all of it and they get it now and you know that they consume it. And I mentioned earlier about horses that don't sweat, and sometimes, these horses can be at much higher risk because we just don't recognize what's going on until it's too late. And so, increased respiration rate, they can't sweat, so they cannot cool themselves. They'll get really fatigued. In these horses, we often see poor skin and coat. Their skin health isn't as good as others. The one last thing that I would talk about, and I think we forget about it, is you've heard me talk about fiber digestion, and when the bugs in um, the gut are digesting, they're producing a lot of heat, and the more non-digestible the fiber is, the more heat that they produce, and so that can produce a lot of heat in a horse. So if we can increase that fiber digestion and make it easier, then we can help those horses out, help them dissipate some of that internal heat. So I think that adding DDA to the diet will actually help to dissipate some of that heat so that we're feeding plenty of fiber in the hay, which we need to for a whole slew of other reasons. But that isn't producing as much heat because we're using the DDA to help them break down that fiber. And then also, if we're sourcing some of our calories from fat, we know that fat does not create a lot of heat when it's broken down. So, questions, and we've already got one question. And I will go ahead and stop the recording. Thank you.